On a night hidden from the eyes of the world, we will journey deep into the Ottoman Palace, tracing silent rituals carried out behind stone walls, drawn from the dusty shelves of Ottoman history. Whispers echoing through the mysterious corridors of the Harem, the disciplined stillness of the Enderun, and ancient rituals lost in the night. All of these will be revealed in this video. This video will transport you beyond the bounds of time, unveiling, in the course of a single night, all that unfolded within the Ottoman Palace, the splendor, the quiet emergence of power, and the entangled lives woven together in this grand structure. What transpired behind the opulent walls of the palace during just one night? Who remained awake? Who prayed? Who waited? And who shed tears? Let us listen together to that deep silence, unseen by eyes, unwritten by pens. Please make sure to watch this video until the very end without skipping. What we are about to share will take you centuries back in time. In the comments, I invite you to share what you're feeling in this moment. What emotions are stirring within you? Tell us your first impression. What did you feel? What did you imagine? Now, close your eyes and picture yourself walking through the shadows of the Ottoman Palace on a winter's night in the 17th century. The moon lit up the Bosphorus like daylight, and the domes of Topkapi Palace rose silently like a prayer beneath the trees dancing with the wind in the palace gardens. Time itself seemed to pause. After a day spent in the presence of the Sultan, night had quietly descended. But this silence was not true stillness. Rather, it was a veil over unseen movements, secretive tasks, and invisible rituals. The palace may have appeared to sleep, but within its walls, everything continued to function. In the harem's long, narrow corridors, the quiet breaths of concubines, walking with measured steps, pierced the silence. Each followed the same rhythm. The fine silk shawls draped over their shoulders brushed the stone floors, creating the faintest of sounds. The bedrooms were lined up like boxes, each holding a different life, a different kind of waiting. Some hoped to catch the Sultan's eye, some accepted their fate, and others prayed in solitude, though they all lived under the same roof. Each one dwelled in a different world. That night, a fragrant incense burned gently in the Valide Sultan's chambers. The scent seemed to summon memories of the past back into the palace. She had ordered an old chest to be opened and taken out letters from within, delicate pages addressed to former sultans and grand viziers, adorned with elegant script. As her hand moved slowly across the lines, she bowed her head slightly, eyes closed, whispering a prayer. That prayer was not only for her son, it was also a plea for the future of the palace. Meanwhile, in the Enderun, inside the privy chamber, a different kind of ceremony was being prepared in silence. The young pages began taking their places under the light of wall-mounted candelabras. Everything was being readied for the late-night prayer and the silent procession that would follow. This ritual was held only on special occasions, and speaking of it beyond the palace walls was strictly forbidden. One of the young men shivered as he washed his hands with cold water before the prayer. It was not excitement he felt, but something closer to sacred fear. For this silent procession was more than a ceremony. It was a rite of passage, a transition into maturity, into secrecy, into belonging to the palace itself. Elsewhere in the back gardens, another shadow moved silently. The palace astrologer had stepped outside to observe the stars. In one hand, he held a small, leather-bound notebook. In the other, a brass astrolabe. He was calculating the hour of the night and mapping the position of the stars. The Sultan would be awakened for his morning prayer, and the astrologer would deliver a special message. Tonight, you will dream, my sovereign. Such dreams were always rich in symbols, and it was the astrologer's duty to interpret them at dawn. Elsewhere in the Harem, lessons for the concubines continued through the night. Quranic recitation, calligraphy practice, quiet embroidery work, all progressed with discipline. The head concubine addressed the young women in a whisper. It was a form of instruction where only lips moved and no sound echoed off the walls. Sometimes a glance, sometimes a nod of the head was enough to carry an entire hour's worth of teaching. As time passed, the palace lights began to dim, one by one. Only certain lamps were left burning. Before the Sultan's chamber, at the Valid Sultan's door, and at the entrance of the privy chamber. This hour of the night was known as the hour of the wakeful. No one spoke aloud. Even footsteps were carefully measured, for at this time, the palace transformed into a sanctuary, not only for the living, but for the spirits of the past, said to roam its halls. In another part of the palace, the head chef stood alone in the kitchen, quietly praying. He had risen early to begin preparations for the morning prayer meal. On the counter were figs, dates, walnuts, and pomegranates. The Sultan had requested a light breakfast, but this preparation was not solely for nourishment. It was part of a ritual. Each ingredient was held in prayer before being washed and immersed in water. In the palace kitchens, spiritual preparation was as important as the physical. Outside, in the outer gardens, the gatekeeper stood at his post, deep in thought. He was waiting for news. Perhaps a secret decree from a distant province, or word of preparations for a campaign. In the darkness, only his eyes seemed visible, glowing faintly. His arms were clasped behind his back, his head slightly bowed. He listened to the night in stillness, without disturbing the silence. And at the very center of this quiet order, a single candle flickered in the Sultan's room. The Sultan was not asleep. He stood at the window, gazing out at the stars. Perhaps he whispered a prayer, or perhaps he pondered the loneliness that came with power. The weight of the empire rested on his shoulders like an invisible armor. That night, he dictated a short letter, maybe to his grand vizier, maybe to a distant child. Yet every word was chosen with care, weighed and refined to suit the solemnity of the night. Every corner of the palace, every step, every breath, and every grain of dust carried a different meaning that night. On one side, prayer. On another, duty. In one place, waiting. In another, action. And all was wrapped in silence. A night in the Ottoman Palace was more than a passing stretch of time. It was an invisible bridge between past and future, and anyone who walked this bridge had to forget who they were and become one with the palace itself. It was the darkest hour of the night in the palace. The sky had turned into black velvet, and the stars sparkled like silver dust scattered upon it. Behind the palace's magnificent walls, time itself seemed to have wrapped itself like a thick blanket. Yet in the Sultan's chamber, there was no sleep. In the innermost sanctum of the palace, in a room that was both modest and grand, the Sultan sat upright by a window. The cloak on his shoulders was not heavy, but the burden he carried was darker than the night itself. From where he sat, the faint silhouette of the sea could be seen beyond his chamber. A cool breeze slipped in through the slightly parted curtain, slicing through the incense-laden air of the room. The Persian carpets on the walls, the gold-embellished Quran on the shelf, and the ebony writing desk in the corner all stood silent, witness to the stillness of the hour. At this time, no one would dare enter the room. Everyone in the palace knew this hour belonged to the Sultan's solitude, and that solitude was a sea made of fears, doubts, and endless mental turmoil about the future of the empire. Each night, the Sultan would plunge into this sea and remain there until dawn. On the Sultan's desk lay several documents. One was a recommendation from the Imperial Council, another a troubling letter from a distant province. But perhaps the most captivating item was a slender poetry journal inscribed with the words, "We bow with loyalty." It belonged to one of the palace pages and had been mysteriously left in his room. The Sultan didn't know who had brought it there, but the verses it contained were profound, simple, and filled with an earnest loneliness. That night, he read them over and over again, recalling his youth, his mother, and the day he first set foot in the palace. Outside, the sound of soft footsteps echoed down the corridor. Then came 3 gentle knocks at the door, a signal, Badr, palace protocol, that the hour of waking was near. A page entered silently, bowing his head. In his hands, he held a note wrapped in a simple, pale blue, silk handkerchief. Approaching the Sultan, he bowed again and offered the handkerchief without a word. The Sultan took it, resting it in his left hand without unfolding it. The page retreated without uttering a single syllable. This gesture was a silent signal that dawn prayer was approaching and that the Sultan was to be awakened. It happened the same way every night. No words, no eye contact, only the handkerchief and the small prayer folded within. The Sultan rose from his seat by the window and draped a thick cloak over his shoulders. As he returned to the window, his eyes searched the sky for the North Star. That star had always guided him. During his first military campaign in his youth, he had followed it, and now, at the peak of his reign, he looked to it once more. Most of his nightly contemplations were quiet reckonings. Which decisions had been right? Which vizier was truly trustworthy? Which concubine was loyal? And who might be secretly corresponding with a rival dynasty? These questions had no certain answers, yet palace life demanded that one move forward amidst these unknowns. But this night was unlike the others. It was special, for in the morning, a crucial state meeting was to be held. Yet that was not all that lingered in the Sultan's mind. Dreams, symbols, and the man with the red banner who had appeared to him a month earlier. He could not forget that vision. The chief astrologer had told him the man represented someone from within. Those words had turned into a nightly warning that echoed in his thoughts. Betrayal does not come from outside. It comes from within. And so the Sultan chose to be alone at night, for solitude was the safest room in the palace. Just then, the oil lamp in the room flickered slightly. The Sultan slowly walked to his desk and unfolded the note from the handkerchief. The prayer was written in delicate script, in Arabic letters, with rosewater ink. It contained the phrase, Rabbi Yasir, a supplication commonly recited in the Ottoman Palace at dawn. It was a plea for ease in one's duties, for paths to be cleared. The Sultan murmured the prayer and wiped his hands over his face. This act marked the final step of his waking ritual. He had now informed both himself and the universe that a new day had begun. He then made his way to the private hammam, prepared for ablution. The water, carried in copper bowls and scented with rose petals, was warm. The first touch of it did not awaken his body, but rather his mind. As he washed his hands, face, and feet, he felt as though he were shedding the traces of the past. Then, donning a simple garment, he returned to his room, ready for morning prayer. The soft steps of the Enderun pages approached. These were the chosen ones, coming from the inner chamber to fulfill their morning duties. In this silent transition from the darkness of night to the light of dawn, no words were needed, no commands given. Everyone knew their role and took their place in silence. The Sultan opened his door. The young men standing outside bowed their heads. In that moment, only one sound echoed through the palace, the morning call to prayer. That call was not merely a summons to worship. It was a sign that the night had ended and a new day had begun. The Sultan stepped forward toward the Enderun. In that walk, there was no gold, no sword, no throne. There was only a man. At the end of the night, the most powerful figure in the palace was simply a servant. And on that night, he walked forward, not as a ruler, but as a man in prayer, surrendering himself to the dawn. Perhaps the most enigmatic part of the palace was the harem. To outsiders, it may have seemed like nothing more than a secluded place where women lived. But inside, another world flowed, another kind of life altogether. Daylight's shimmer blended into the silence of the night, and every step held a possibility. Every glance carried a message. Within the walls of the harem existed a language that never echoed, yet said so much. The language of looks, of posture, of every silent movement. And when night fell, that language deepened in meaning, for night was the time of whispers, of secret letters, of forbidden thoughts, arcades stacked upon each other, ornate arches, delicate columns. Footsteps echoed softly along stone corridors, washed in the scent of roses. Amid the silence, a soft laugh would sometimes flicker and then vanish as quickly as it appeared. The ladies of the harem struggled at night to pass unseen, to exist without leaving a trace. Everyone had their place, their duty, and their limits. And crossing those limits meant getting burned. A faint light coming from the Valide Sultan's quarters signaled she was still awake. That night, she was praying with her head attendants and at the same time trying to keep the rising tension among the favorites under control. In recent weeks, a new concubine had begun to draw the Sultan's attention. She was very young, said to be of Circassian origin. Her alabaster skin and clear eyes had caught the Sultan's eye during a morning service. That alone was a sign of an approaching storm, for a concubine's rise to the ranks of the favorites was not merely a matter of affection, it was seen as a political ascension as well. The other favorites were far from pleased with this development, especially Mahfiruz Kalfa, who had maintained her position in the palace for many years and had even borne a child for the Sultan, thus commanding significant influence. But the young concubine's rising star was beginning to unsettle the delicate network of relationships and silent alliances Mahfiruz had built around herself. Secret letters were being written at night, tiny notes wrapped in silk handkerchiefs, passed discreetly from hand to hand via the palace maids. Some of these messages promised loyalty, while others threatened to expose the secrets of rivals. The young concubine was rarely called by her name. In the harem, those whose names were never spoken were either deeply loved or deeply feared. She was still somewhere in between, silent yet acutely observant. With every gesture, she studied who served whom, who exchanged glances with whom. In her early days, she acted almost mute, keeping her head bowed in silence. But that night, she had spoken to someone for the first time, sitting on silk cushions, wrapped in her nightgown under the flickering light of a pale oil lamp. She quietly pondered her place. An old palace servant approached and handed her a small prayer book. "A gift from the Valide Sultan," the woman said softly. This was seen as a token of acceptance. A space was now openly being made for her in the harem. But that also meant that all eyes were now on her. In the harem, night was never fully dark. Small lamps, candles placed in wall niches, and the flickering lights carried by the passing servants created an atmosphere that hovered between dimness and brightness. This half-light concealed secrets even as it magnified them, for nothing was ever entirely seen, and nothing ever completely heard. The language of the night was spoken in unfinished sentences. At the far end of the grand harem corridor, two concubines walked in silence. One was Farah, one of Mahfiruz's closest girls. The other was a secret observer, assigned to watch the new concubine. There were no spoken conversations between them. Instead, they communicated through small marks in notebooks, by exchanging tiny notes, or by something as subtle as a nod, for speaking aloud could reveal things. But silence often held far greater power. In the palace, it was not the ones who spoke who ruled, but those who guided without uttering a word. That night, a stir was noticed near the window overlooking the harem's main inner garden. One of the sentry concubines reported seeing a shadow moving in the garden at midnight. This was no ordinary event. Women outside the harem were strictly forbidden from entering that garden. But the figure seen there wasn't a woman. It was a palace page. Beside him stood another youth, short and slender. They spoke no words, only walked side by side along the stone path. This encounter hinted at a secret that transcended the rigid hierarchy of the harem, a forbidden connection, perhaps a romance, an escape plan, or even a covert intelligence exchange within the palace. Any of these were possible. The Valide Sultan remained awake until the morning call to prayer. Her chambermaid brought her hot water mixed with lavender oil. With every sip, she whispered a prayer. Not only the fate of the Sultan, but also that of the harem and the entire Ottoman dynasty rested on her delicate balance. A single word from her could seal a concubine's destiny. For her, night was not a time of rest, it was a time of reckoning. When night ended in the harem, no one asked another what they had seen or what they knew. Everyone kept their observations to themselves, holding their knowledge close until the right time to use it arrived. With the morning light, everything that had transpired during the night became a locked secret in people's minds. But those secrets accumulated within the palace walls, forming the foundation for future decisions, exiles, marriages, or purges. That is why the events of the night in the harem were not merely a passing of time, they were a test of wisdom. The ones who survived were those who knew, but remained silent. And on that night, this silent wisdom once again drifted between the walls of the palace, becoming its most invisible source of power. Within the silence of the palace, there existed another world, the Enderun. This part of the inner palace, known as the Enderun, was where the Ottoman Empire forged its hidden intellect, its statecraft, loyalty, and absolute discipline. If the harem was the domain of emotions, desire, and intrigue, the Enderun was the realm of reason, obedience, and preparation for the future. It was a universe reserved only for the chosen few, a place completely cut off from the outside world, yet deepened within. Here, too, the night did not bring sleep, for nightfall marked one of the most intense hours of education. The young boys admitted inside would realize from their first day that they now belonged to an entirely different world, regardless of their language, homeland, or background. All were melted into a single mold. Within this circular system, each had to first learn how to become nothing. Their names were forgotten, their identities erased, only to be rebuilt anew. To be of the Enderun was to forget oneself and merge with the soul of the state. This process of forgetting was often filled with pain, silence, and long, sleepless nights. That night was one such moment in this long journey. As the hours passed, and the outer courtyards of the palace sank into darkness, the small lamps in the rooms of the Enderun remained lit. In the Has Oda, the privy chamber, a few young students were still receiving instruction under the silent supervision of the Bashlala, the chief attendant. The lesson was clear: Ottoman history. But it wasn't just about events. It was about the intentions behind them. They did not simply study why sultans went to war, but also why they chose not to. For a true statesman must wield not only his sword, but also his intellect. Equally important as night education in the Enderun was murakaba, self-observation, the control of one's ego. Each night, after a certain hour, all students retreated to their rooms, but they were not allowed to sleep. Each was given a personal note focused on inner discipline. These notes contained prayers, wise sayings, or interpretations of historical events. The aim was for the student to reflect on the topic with his own mind, to quietly question and contemplate. No answer was ever entirely right or wrong, because what mattered most was not the answer itself, but the way of thinking. In one of those rooms, a young page sat with his head resting on his knees, staring at the paper before him. The words on it were clear: silence precedes words. That sentence began to pull him into deep reflection. A mistake he had made earlier that day came to mind. While walking on the Divan Road, He had taken slightly hurried steps and unknowingly passed a superior without noticing. The man had said nothing, but that night, during his murakaba, he had to think about it. Discipline here was not just imposed from the outside, it was maintained through an inner sense of self-governance. In the depths of the dark night, the chief astrologer passed slowly in front of the Hazoda and climbed to the upper floor to observe the stars. With his passage, all the students briefly stood up in respect, then sat again. Even that small movement was a lesson: to be aware of the watching eye, to remain composed at all times. Life here meant being constantly observed. That eye was often invisible, yet its presence was always felt. Mistakes might be remembered years later. Even if no punishment was given at the time, they would be recorded, and those records could one day open a path or close it entirely. In another room, an older page was quietly reciting the Quran to himself. His Arabic was flawless. The words flowed from his lips in silence, but the peace reflected on his face spoke more than words ever could. The surah he recited was Surat al-Insan, the chapter of mankind. That night, his murakaba note contained truths about the human condition. He asked himself, "Who am I? What do I serve?" The answers to these questions could determine not just his own fate, but potentially the destiny of the entire state. Just before dawn, another ritual began in the Enderun, the morning inspection. During this quiet check, the Bashlala and his aides would walk through the students' rooms and observe. Who had fallen asleep? Who was still working? Who was praying? Who was merely sitting? These observations were never written down, but they were never forgotten either, for what truly mattered was how brightly the student's inner light continued to burn. That night, one student was practicing calligraphy by the glow of a small oil lamp. At the top of each line, he wrote a single word: loyalty. He repeated each letter again and again, rewriting as the ink dried. A small amulet hanging on the wall had once belonged to his mother. He hadn't seen her in years, but he thought of her every night. That remembrance kept his patience and loyalty alive. In the Enderun, most students forgot their families and replaced them with the state and the sultan. Yet some bonds, even in the quietest corners, were impossible to erase. As the call to dawn prayer neared, all the students gathered together. A small circle of prayer was formed. The Bashlala stepped forward and recited a silent prayer. Then, each student bowed his head. This was a nightly oath of allegiance. No one spoke aloud, but every eye and every breath was a vow: loyalty, patience, silence, and service. In the Enderun, the night was not a time of learning, but of maturation. Darkness here was not simply the absence of light, but a mirror in which one turned inward. Every night, those who looked into that mirror saw themselves anew, acknowledged their flaws, and polished away their excesses. For here, true power lay not in raising one's voice, but in remaining silent with patience. And that night, too, ended with patience. The walls of the Enderun overflowed once more with loyalty. With the first light of dawn, the soft footsteps of the young men whispered that the silent architects of the empire's future were still in the making. In the late hours of the night, a different kind of silence would begin to reign deep within the palace. Behind the opulent walls of the harem, the day's chaos slowly gave way to a heavy and profound stillness, while the disciplined students of the Enderun retired to rest. Yet, there was another element that safeguarded the soul of the palace. The chief astrologer, Munichimbasha, and the meticulously conducted nightly rituals under his care. These rituals were not only connected to daily life, but also formed a powerful bond with the fate of the Sultan and the empire. The chief astrologer occupied himself in the most secluded corners of the palace, observing the movements of the stars and planets, every celestial shift, every zodiac transition, every lunar phase served as a portent of decisions to be made in state affairs. This subtle vigilance was a silent force shaping the destiny of the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan's fortune, the success of the army, and the prosperity of the state all depended on the calculations of the chief astrologer. That night, beneath the grand dome, the chief astrologer had laid out a star chart before him. His young assistants sat quietly at his side, taking diligent notes. Each line, each symbol, was examined with precision, explained, and interpreted. The sky was unusually active that night. The rare alignment of planets was seen as a sign of a new era for the Sultan. This knowledge had not yet reached the other wings of the palace, but the chief astrologer was entrusted with it, for he was the sole bearer of this hidden wisdom to be shared only with the Sultan. As part of the rituals, the chief astrologer recited special prayers in the stillness of the night. These prayers were meant to gather the energies of the universe and to summon the wisdom hidden in darkness. The talismans inscribed on a parchment took on meaning in the flickering light of candles. These talismans were appeals to the palace's protective spirits, a shield against malevolent forces. At the same time, these magical symbols functioned as an invisible barrier, crucial for the safety of the Sultan and the palace. As the night wore on, various silent rituals unfolded in different parts of the palace. In the harem, concubines and attendants, bearing the weight of the day, calmed their bodies through specific meditative movements and whispered prayers. These prayers held not only personal significance, but also served the integrity of the palace as a whole. For the Ottoman Palace was not merely a collection of individuals, it was the fusion of many souls into a single grand spirit. In the Enderun, the young men receiving their education were influenced by the chief astrologer's prayers, viewing the night as a time for both learning and spiritual fortification. These prayers instilled in them a silent strength and patience, offering a protective aura for their futures. In the palace, night was not merely for physical rest, it was a time for deep spiritual renewal. Another pivotal moment of the night unfolded in the Sultan's private prayer chamber. There, in complete solitude and intense concentration, the Sultan offered his prayers. These prayers were the hidden force behind the decisions that shaped the fate of the empire. In the silence of the night, the Sultan confronted himself, feeling the full weight of the state upon his shoulders. The subtle vibrations from the palace's other chambers lent a mystical force to his contemplation and decisions. Throughout the night, as the chief astrologer continued to update the star chart, he bore witness to the echoing of these silent rituals within the palace. With every step and every word he deepened the palace's magical atmosphere. For he was not only the reader of the skies, but also the one who kept the pulse of the palace's soul. To him, the night was a secret, a revelation, and a sacred duty. By the time the palace gates were shut and the first light of dawn began to rise, these silent rituals had prepared the empire for a new day. Everything remained unseen, yet its impact was immense. In the Ottoman Palace, night was not merely a time of sleep, it was a quiet journey through destiny, wisdom, and the depths of the soul. As the palace's heavy doors slowly closed, the rituals and silence of the night began to yield to the first light of dawn. The prayers, lessons, and quiet observations that had filled the night were now gently threading their way into the morning like an invisible thread. Every corridor, every room began to pass on the secrets it had kept through the night to a new day, while the palace residents quietly returned to their duties. By the early hours of the morning, the daily rituals for all those living within the palace walls had already begun. In the harem, the concubines awoke silently, shedding the night in preparation for a new day. Though traces of fatigue and sleeplessness lingered on their faces, their sense of duty and devotion to the order of the palace always came first. The heavy atmosphere of the night slowly dissolved with the fresh breath of morning. In the Enderun, discipline returned with the first rays of the sun. The students, having spent the night immersed in study and introspection, now felt the weight of knowledge and state service on their shoulders. Under the watchful gaze of the Bashlala, every movement was carefully observed, every behavior evaluated as a test. The influence of the lessons learned during the night revealed itself in the morning's first gatherings. In the Sultan's private chamber, morning prayers had begun. After a night of deep inner contemplation, the Sultan greeted the new day with hope and resolve. Prayer and meditation were sacred rituals that shaped his decisions. This practice sent a message to every soul within the palace. Each new day signified the rebirth of the Ottoman Empire's power and splendor. With the first light of day, the chief astrologer conducted his final review of the star charts. He was now prepared to reflect the wisdom of the night in the daily decisions of the statesman. The movements of the heavens laid the foundations for new strategies and guided the Sultan's policies. This knowledge stood as one of the palace's most invisible yet most powerful pillars. As life in the palace gradually reawakened, the silent rituals of the night still lingered like an unseen mantle upon all. Each person, in fulfilling their duties, carried the memory of the night within their hearts and minds. This act of carrying was both a responsibility and an honor, for life in the palace was measured not merely by physical presence, but by a deep spiritual devotion. And thus, another night came to an end in the Ottoman Palace, the mysterious world of the Harem, the disciplined realm of the Enderun, and the chief astrologer's silent communion with the stars were all passed on to a new day with the arrival of dawn. What had transpired throughout the night was a silent investment in the future of the state. The meanings hidden behind these quiet rituals continue to echo not only through the depths of that era, but into the reflections of our present day as well. Thank you for listening to this story that takes you deep into the heart of history. I continue to share similar stories on my channel. If you enjoy content like this, feel free to subscribe now. See you in a new story. Take care.